And so the story begins with a moment in a garden, a moment as a choice is made. And in this moment, things change. A cosmic battle commences. God versus Satan. Good versus evil. Angels versus demons. Life versus death. Light versus darkness. And as the story continues, there are kings and prophets. There are floods and wars. There are conspiracies and murder. There are empires and kingdoms. And then there comes another moment. Another garden. Another choice. Every day we are faced with decisions. Some we make without a second thought. Others take more time, they're more complex. Often the hardest choices to make are those with the greatest consequences. A few hours before this moment in this garden, Jesus is celebrating the Passover feast with his closest friends. They finish eating and they leave Jerusalem, probably singing songs as was their custom, songs about God's faithfulness. They head down the steep banks of the Kidron Valley, up towards the Mount of Olives, and they get to a certain place called Gethsemane, and there they stop. Now Jesus knew this place well, but this time it was different. It was night, it was quiet, and a choice had to be made. As Jesus enters the garden, his whole demeanor changes. He is full of sorrow, and the weight of the choice he is about to make becomes visible on his face. We often think of Jesus as victorious, as bold and strong, able to overcome even death itself. But in this moment, we discover a different side of Jesus. The man who struggles, who is pained. Jesus, the wrestler. And the choice that he's wrestling with is this: whether or not to go to the cross. We often take for granted what Jesus did on the cross. But here, in this moment, in this garden, in this man, the whole of human history rests. Jesus leaves many of his disciples on the very edge of the garden, and he ventures in deeper with Peter, James, and John, his closest friends. To them he says, "Please wait here, but don't fall into temptation. Pray for me." And then Jesus says these words: "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." These are powerful words. Overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I mean, how does that feel? I can hardly even begin to imagine. And then he walks a short distance away, a stone's throw away. He needs to be alone. This is a decision that only he can make. He then falls on his knees and prays, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me." In this moment of anguish, as he faces the reality of death, he still calls God Father. He still understands that his Father in heaven loves him. How often when times are tough, when difficult choices must be made, do we remember our Father in heaven? take this cup from me, Jesus says. Now the cup here is significant. It symbolizes the suffering that he must endure and echoes the cup that Jesus held earlier that evening as they remembered the horror of death the night God's people were freed. Death is close, and Jesus knows it, and so Jesus wrestles. In this moment, we get a glimpse of what Jesus is going through. He is there in Gethsemane. Gethsemane means the pressing place. This was a place where olives are squeezed and pressed to produce olive oil. The weight of the decision is pressing heavily upon Jesus, forcing out the life-giving goodness, but crushing him in the process. The pressure is not only internal. Luke explains how the pressure of the situation is causing Jesus to sweat, but to sweat so intensely that droplets of blood begin to form on his head. It was during World War I, as troops prepared to get out of their trenches and march towards their enemy, that they too sweated blood. The pressure of the situation was so intense. In this moment, as he prays, Jesus knows what lies in store. Jesus understands the pain he will suffer if he goes through with this. He knows what happens at a crucifixion. Everyone does. He knows the pain he will endure, the beating he will receive, the nails through his hands, the spear in his side. And so he wrestles. But Jesus also knows the emotional pain that he will have to endure. He knows that one of his closest friends will betray him. He knows that even after 3 years of following him, his disciples won't stand by him. He knows that even Peter will deny having anything to do with him. And so he wrestles. Jesus understands that more than the physical and emotional torture, that he will also be separated from the Father, his Father. The Trinity will be torn apart as Jesus takes upon himself the sin of the world. Jesus feels his humanity as grief engulfs him, and so he wrestles. And as he wrestles, as his soul is overwhelmed with sorrow, as he faces this cup of suffering, his closest friends sleep.
"Why are you sleeping?" he asks.
Not just once or twice, but 3 times. 3 times as